Hi, everybody. I'm going to tell you a story today, a history to be specific. It's the history of the people of God, the Israelites, beginning with Abraham and ending with a recap of the events recorded in Ezra and a glimpse of coming attractions in Nehemiah. It's going to be pretty information heavy because a lot of what I'm doing is reviewing what we've been through for those who weren't here last semester, or those whose memories of it are fuzzy, or those who never really did get all the comings and goings last time, and I have sympathy for that. But first, I'm going to lead up to the book of Ezra because there's a lot that happens before it that's relevant to it. Let's go way back to the first half of Genesis, where God called Abraham to be the start of the family that would ultimately become the Israelites, a people that would be his own prized possession, a nation he would tend and mold and ultimately use to bless all nations. Among the many promises God gave Abraham is the promise of land, the promised land. He said, "The whole land of Canaan, where you are now an alien, I will give you as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you." This promise wasn't fulfilled immediately. First, the Israelites had a 400-year sojourn in Egypt and 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Before the Israelites entered the land, God gave them fair warning about what could happen in great detail. For one thing, he specifically warned them against intermarrying with the peoples of Canaan, the peoples they were to defeat. For, he said, "They will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods." And he promised them, "If you obey my commands, all will go well, and you will enjoy lives of peace and prosperity in the land. But if you fall away from me, you'll be cursed. All kinds of evil will befall you. And the Lord will bring a nation against you from far away, from the ends of the earth, like an eagle swooping down." After a period of conquest to take the promised land and a period of rule by judges, not a good time, God gave the people a king. Only 3 kings ruled for any length of time over Israel as a single united nation: Saul, David, and Solomon. Solomon was the one God gave the privilege of building a house for him in Jerusalem, the capital. However, Solomon foolishly married pagan wives, and even though God had specifically warned the Israelites against that before they ever even entered the land, and sure enough, they led him astray. After Solomon, there was a big political mess, and the kingdom of Israel ended up splitting into 2 smaller kingdoms. The one in the north kept the name Israel and made the city of Samaria its capital, and the kingdom in the south, which needed a new name, became known as Judah and kept Jerusalem as its capital. Not all, but too many of the kings in both kingdoms were terrible, ungodly men, and the people got caught up in all kinds of evil. The northern kingdom of Israel slid downhill faster. God sent prophets to warn them that he would punish them, and when they didn't listen, he sent the Assyrians to basically wipe the nation out. Judah limped on a little longer, but in the end, its inhabitants were no better at remaining faithful to God and his commands than the Israelites had been. Again, God sent prophets to warn them against the many sins he saw them committing. These prophets railed against the way the people oppressed the poor and defenseless. They exhorted the people to honor God by keeping the Sabbath. And they condemned the way the people turned from God to superstition and idolatry and clasped their hands with pagans. But again, the people refused to change their ways, and again, God sent an invading army. This time, the invading empire was different, and the fate of the people of the southern kingdom, Judah, was different from the fate of the people of the northern kingdom. Judah was invaded by the Babylonians, whose king was Nebuchadnezzar. Instead of essentially dissolving the people, as the Assyrians had done in Israel, the Babylonians took over the defeated people of Judah. They looked them over. They took back with them everyone they thought was promising or influential or potentially useful to them in some way. And they also pretty much destroyed the city of Jerusalem, including the temple and the walls. The Babylonians took captives off to Babylon 3 separate times until only the very poorest folks were left behind to eke out an existence the best they could in the land of Judah. But the prophets who had uttered words of warning also spoke words of hope. Through the prophet Jeremiah, God reassured his people, "When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place." The next verse is that famous verse, written in its original context to people who'd been attacked and conquered and taken far from their homeland. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." And Isaiah looked ahead to the time of Ezra. "I am the Lord who says of Cyrus, 'He is my shepherd and will accomplish all that I please.' He will say of Jerusalem, 'Let it be rebuilt,' and of the temple, 'Let its foundations be laid.' I will raise up Cyrus in my righteousness. He will rebuild my city and set my exiles free." In this world, kingdoms rise and kingdoms fall. Persia, with its king Cyrus, was the next big power on the scene, and the Persian Empire swallowed up the Babylonian Empire. This brings us to the place where we began in September, the opening of the book of Ezra. Or you could say the opening of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. They've often been viewed as parts of the same book. For years, they were viewed that way. So sometimes I'll refer to Ezra, sometimes to Nehemiah, and sometimes to the superbook of Ezra and Nehemiah. There's continuity between the two of them, as you would expect from books that are sometimes viewed as two parts of the same. I'll mention a few similarities now. One is that both Ezra and Nehemiah are kind of mashups of different genres, and one type of writing bumps right up against another type. So there's third-person historical narrative, first-person memoir, lists, lots of lists, and interestingly, bureaucratic documents like letters and memos, some of which aren't even in Hebrew, but are in Aramaic. Ezra and Nehemiah together contain accounts of 3 separate waves of exiled Jews returning to the Promised Land. 2 groups return in Ezra, one larger and one smaller, and a third group returns at the beginning of Nehemiah. Another thing the books have in common is this pattern. The people make progress on a building project. They encounter opposition in a variety of forms. They stop work, or maybe the fate of the work is kind of hanging in the balance, and then they eventually resume and complete the work. So let's do a quick run through of the events of Ezra with a tiny look at what we'll see in Nehemiah. This is just the basics kind of run through. Ezra begins with the event that Isaiah prophesied. Cyrus the Great, king of the sprawling Persian Empire, issues a proclamation permitting Jewish exiles to return to Judah, their homeland, the Promised Land. Any Jewish exile is allowed to go who wants to, and close to 50,000 head out, which is a lot. But it's far from everyone who is eligible. Many choose to stay in Babylon. Those intrepid souls who do return have their work cut out for them. The journey to Judah goes smoothly, and the returned exiles get off to a great start. Once in Jerusalem, they immediately build an altar to the Lord, sacrifice burnt offerings on it, celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, and so on. Their main project, which they tackle next, is the reconstruction of the entire temple. In fact, Cyrus's decree told them that this was why he was allowing them to return, and Cyrus sent them on their way with everything they would need for this enormous task. They get as far as completing the temple foundation, and they celebrate this milestone, though some of the older exiles who remember the first temple, the one Solomon built, weep when they see that the new temple will be nowhere near as magnificent as the old one. So that's stage 1 of the recurring pattern I mentioned, progress on a building project. But then stage 2, the opposition begins. The peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building. They hired counselors to work against them and frustrate their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, and down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Construction screeches to a halt and stays halted. After 16 years and the urging of two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, the building process finally begins again. Soon there's another potential roadblock. "Hey," says Tatanai, the governor of their region of the empire, "you guys got a building permit?" Persian bureaucrats to the rescue. Their meticulous record-keeping keeps the work from being stopped. A copy of King Cyrus's original decree from years ago is unearthed from the files. Disaster is averted. The new temple is finally completed 22 years and a few kings after Cyrus issued his decree. After all that, it's no surprise that the people hold a huge celebration. They dedicate the temple and they install priests and Levites, their helpers, so that they can get about their work, like presiding over the feast of Passover, which they observe not long after the temple's dedication. It seems that at this point, things just hum along for a time. The completion and dedication of the temple are described in chapter 6 of Ezra, and the events at the beginning of chapter 7 take place almost 60 years later. It's in chapter 7 that we finally meet Ezra himself. Ezra is a priest and a teacher well-versed in the law of Moses. He leads a second wave of exiles back from Babylon to their ancestral homeland of Judah. At the time Ezra leaves Babylon for Jerusalem, Artaxerxes is the ruler of the Persian Empire, and he'll be king during all the rest of the events we will read about through the end of Nehemiah. Anyway, like Cyrus, King Artaxerxes allows anyone to return who wishes, and like Cyrus, he gives Ezra, the leader of the expedition, anything he might need. Ezra and his companions arrive safely in Jerusalem, but just a few months after their arrival, Ezra is informed of a problem. The people of Israel, which is what the returned exiles are now referred to as, the people of Israel have been intermarrying with the neighboring peoples. And to make matters worse, we read that the leaders and officials have led the way in doing this. Ezra is deeply grieved. He tears his tunic and his hair and his beard. He prays, he weeps, he throws himself on the ground. Why is he so upset? He remembers God's warning against intermarriage. He remembers the idolatry that people in the past fell into who didn't heed that warning, including, as we've seen, Solomon. At any rate, the people, seeing Ezra's reaction, are moved to act. After deliberation and case-by-case examinations, the offending marriages are dissolved. And with the long list of all the men who had married pagan wives and whose marriages have now been dissolved, the book draws to a close. As you delve into Nehemiah this semester, you'll come across a number of elements that will look familiar to you from Ezra. Though one introduction to the book notes that Nehemiah relates these elements with a stronger narrative flair. So you have that to look forward to. Nehemiah, living in exile, is given permission to go to Jerusalem by Artaxerxes, whom we've met before. One difference is that Nehemiah isn't coming back to stay permanently. Artaxerxes wants Nehemiah back because he's a trusted member of his staff. But Artaxerxes does give Nehemiah leave to make 2 long trips to the Promised Land, and in fact appoints him governor of Judah. Like the first returnees at the beginning of Ezra, Nehemiah has a building project to complete. This time, it's the walls of Jerusalem, which have been down since the Babylonians swept through. Like those who rebuilt the temple, Nehemiah and his workers will face opposition from neighboring peoples. And like Ezra, Nehemiah will need to clean house in Judah. The problem of intermarriage will crop up again. There's injustice against the poor of the land. The population of the city needs to be beefed up. Sabbath laws need to be enforced. You will see that, like Ezra, Nehemiah is zealous for the law, but he has a different leadership style. One major new element in the book of Nehemiah is a huge gathering where Ezra the priest reads the law to the assembled Israelites, and the people are moved to confess their sins and bind themselves with an oath to follow the law of God given through Moses. Those are the bones of the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. It's kind of a bare bones version, though. It misses a lot of the significance of what's really going on. It doesn't convey the weight of the things that happened or the force behind them. Telling the story in the way I just did is maybe a little bit like a girl who comes home and tells her family she's met a nice young man, and the family wants to know, well, what's he like? And the girl responds, he has 2 arms and 2 legs and 1 head and a couple hundred bones, and he's 1.5 inches taller than I am. Oh, and he has dark hair. The family might very reasonably then say, no, what's he like? And that's what we need to do now with the history I've just told you. Put some meat on the bare bones. Explore themes and emphases and wider implications of the events I've just basically listed. And these emphases are carried through in both Ezra and Nehemiah. In putting this section of my talk together, I need to note that I was particularly helped by the breakdown of themes in Derek Kidner's commentary on Ezra and Nehemiah. All right, first and foremost, Ezra and Nehemiah has a lot to say about God. Throughout, God is shown to be great and awesome, as Nehemiah puts it. He's called the God of heaven and earth. In their prayer on behalf of the people in Nehemiah, the Levites declare, "You alone are the Lord. You made the heavens, even the highest heavens, and all their starry host, the earth and all that is in it, the seas and all that is in them. You give life to everything, and the multitudes of heaven worship you." This powerful creator God is shown over and over to be the driving force behind all those events in Ezra and Nehemiah. As we've already seen from Isaiah, God is the one who raised Cyrus up and placed him in power. And Ezra tells us that it was God who moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make his proclamation. And it's God who stirs up the spirits of the people who go. Later we read that God is the one who changes the attitude of Darius so that he helps the Israelites in their work on the temple instead of forcing it to stop. In Nehemiah 4, God gets the credit for frustrating the plot of the Israelites' enemies. You can see in all these examples that God is powerfully working things out on behalf of his people. And in his work of moving the hearts and changing the attitudes of kings, God goes above and beyond what it seems like one could reasonably expect. The 3 groups that return to Judah from exile don't receive grudging by the skin of your teeth permission to go. Yeah, I guess you can go back if you really have to, whatever. No. To the first group, Cyrus gives all the treasures the Babylonians took from the temple when they destroyed it. In all, we are told there were 5,400 articles of gold and silver. He also tells the Jews who are not returning to contribute silver and gold and goods and livestock to the cause. Later, King Darius gives the Israelites the green light to carry on with their work after the governor Tattenai questions it. Along with the green light, however, he gives the Israelites protection from interference, money from the royal treasury to pay their expenses, a constant supply of animals and wheat and salt and wine and oil, everything that the people will need for their offerings in the temple. Similarly, Artaxerxes gives Ezra silver and gold, the means to get more silver, wheat, wine, olive oil, salt, an exemption from taxes for all the temple workers, the authority to appoint officials and teach the law and enforce it. Later, Artaxerxes gives Nehemiah 2 years-long leaves of absence from Judah, and at Nehemiah's request, a letter that will enable him to get all the wood he's going to need to build the temple, the walls, the gates, and even his own private residence. Nehemiah tells us that Artaxerxes gives him these things because the gracious hand of my God was upon me. You might recognize that image of God's hand. It appears several times in the book of Ezra to convey God's protection of and provision for those who are trusting in him. It's all so over the top. Again and again, God arranges for his people to have everything they need and more. He does this because the God who is the creator of heaven and earth is the God who chose Abraham, the one who has been in relationship with his people for centuries upon centuries, for good and for ill, who has all along been working his plan for all of history through them. This God is shown to be faithful to them and faithful to his promises. After all, the book of Ezra begins by telling us that God moved Cyrus to make his proclamation to fulfill the promise he'd given the people through Jeremiah. We see that element of relationship also in the many prayers scattered throughout Ezra and Nehemiah. We see people talking to God, both in groups and as individuals, from the massive corporate prayer of confession following the reading of the law in Nehemiah, to the individual prayer of the innocent Ezra, who confesses with tears the people's sin of intermarriage, to the prayers sprinkled through Nehemiah in which Nehemiah asks the Lord to remember him. And then there's my favorite, the quick prayer Nehemiah lobs up to the God of heaven before he makes his request of King Artaxerxes. And the God of heaven grants him favor with the king. So that's at least some of what Ezra and Nehemiah has to say about God. It also has things to say about the people of God. From the arrival of the first returning exiles on, we see in the people a desire to follow God's law. As the people work on their first project, the altar, they're determined to do everything in accordance with what is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. They are determined to establish continuity with the laws and temple practices and life and promises that belong to God's people before the exile. They want to do things right this time. So when the people who live around Judah offer to help the Israelites with the construction of the temple, the leaders of the Israelites respond with a firm nope. They're not being standoffish. They just recognize that these people pose a danger to the nation they're so carefully rebuilding. Ezra is a model priest. We are told that he had devoted himself to the study and observance of the law of the Lord and to teaching its decrees and laws in Israel. He loves the law and comes from Babylon to Judah with the desire to help the people there learn it and obey it. In Nehemiah, the people take that oath, dedicating themselves to following the law, a binding agreement which they put in writing, and the Levites and priests affix their seals to it. When the sin of intermarriage with the neighboring peoples is exposed and Ezra mourns, the people themselves make the wrenching decision to dissolve those marriages. When the sin of intermarriage pops up again at the end of Nehemiah, Nehemiah roots it out, reminding the offenders of the sin that Solomon fell into and making them take an oath never to do it again. When the sin of exploiting the poor arises, Nehemiah roots it out and makes the leaders take an oath not to do that anymore. When Eliashib, the priest, misuses the temple, Nehemiah straightens that out. When the people disregard Sabbath law, Nehemiah takes them to task. Perhaps you see the problem emerging here. The people rightly desire to obey the law, and sometimes they succeed. But then something somewhere eventually goes wrong. As Piper pointed out in her lecture, exile, leaving and coming back, hasn't fixed the root problem, the problem of the sinful heart. The new temple isn't going to fix the problem. The walls aren't going to fix it. Godly leaders like Ezra and Nehemiah can do some damage control, but they can't fix the root problem either. A bigger, deeper work is needed. And the events of Ezra and Nehemiah are moving us toward the time when that bigger, deeper work will be done. In terms of time, history, Nehemiah takes us pretty much right to the end of the Old Testament period. What needed to happen has happened. People are back from exile. Society is functioning. The temple system is up and running. Jerusalem is once again a walled city. The stage is set. Then there's a 400-year wait, during which the Persian Empire will fall, the Greeks will come and go, the Romans will rise. And in a little Roman province, 400 years after Nehemiah, the Messiah will be born. He will enter Jerusalem to teach and heal and celebrate festivals, and he will come in through the gates built by the people in Nehemiah's time. And one day, he will leave the city through those gates to be crucified outside the walls they built. And through his death and resurrection and sending of the Spirit, he will fix the problem.